According to legend, the great city of Rome was founded on a murder. It all started with two twin brothers, Romulus and Remus, leading an expedition to found a new city beside the Tiber River. They knew they wanted to build somewhere on one of the hills, but they couldn't agree on which one. Romulus, focused on military defense, chose the centrally located Palatine Hill. Remus, thinking of trade and commerce, preferred the Aventini, which was closer to the river. Their disagreement exploded into a full-blown conflict, splitting their followers into two camps, the Palatine faction under Romulus and the Aventini faction under Remus. Unable to reach an agreement, each side decided to seek a sign from the gods. They performed animal sacrifices and waited. Remus and his followers on the Aventini Hill were the first to receive a sign, 6 vultures flying overhead. As the brothers claimed descent from Mars, the god of war, whose bird was the vulture. This seemed like a clear message. Remus, elated, marched over to his brother to share the news. But Romulus responded with a bombshell. He had just seen 12 vultures land on his hill. "You're a liar," Remus fumed, demanding to see the birds for himself, even after seeing them. He wasn't satisfied. He argued that his sign had appeared first, which must mean the gods favored him. Romulus countered that 12 vultures were obviously better than 6, and the fact that they had landed on his hill meant that was the fated spot. The argument escalated, and the brothers retreated to their separate camps. To hell with this, Romulus must have thought as he began construction on the Palatine Hill. His first task was to dig a trench that would serve as the foundation for the city walls. When Remus saw what his brother was doing, he and his followers stormed over, weapons in hand. Remus angrily stepped across the trench, and a fight broke out. When the dust settled, Remus was dead. Tradition says Romulus struck the killing blow. Romulus went on to build his city on the Palatine Hill, naming it Roma, or Rome, after himself. How much of this is true? Maybe some, maybe none. But the important thing is that later generations of Romans fully integrated this story into their mythology. But this is all only tangentially related to what I really want to talk about today. You see, that simple trench dug by Romulus became one of the cornerstones of the Roman legal system. That trench is known as the Pomerium. The Latin word for city is urb, which comes from the word orbis, meaning circle. This connection is no coincidence. In a legal sense, anything inside a city's Pomerium was considered the actual city, and everything outside was something else entirely. Most cities on the Italian peninsula had a similar boundary, but for obvious reasons, Rome's was the most significant dot over the centuries. Rome grew far beyond the Palatine Hill, eventually encompassing all 7 hills and more. While some early rulers tried to expand the Pomerium to keep up, it was an impossible task. Eventually, people accepted that in a legal sense, Rome's official city limits were just a small part of a much larger, unofficial city. As the city grew, the original walls of the Pomerium became less and less important, gradually fading away until the boundary was nothing more than an open gap between buildings, marked only by a few ceremonial stone pillars. It was an invisible line, well known to locals but easy for the untrained eye to miss. Entering the Pomerium was a highly ritualized experience deeply tied to Roman law and religious belief. The hyperlegalistic Romans justified Remus's murder by arguing that any breach of the Pomerium, even just walking across the invisible line, represented a symbolic breach of Rome's defenses. Therefore, crossing the Pomerium was a death penalty offense. So how did people get in? The Pomerium was not a solid line. It stopped and started again at a series of designated gates. According to Roman religious thought, these gates were sacred because they had been sanctioned by the gods back in Romulus's time. This led to some absurd situations. After the walls themselves had disappeared, the historian Plutarch tells the story of the general Pompey, who, after a military victory, tried and failed to get a group of elephants through one of these disconnected gates. Even though the land on either side was completely open, it never even occurred to anyone to take 2 steps to the left and walk across the invisible line. That's how seriously the Romans took the Pomerium. In fact, in every meaningful sense, the Pomerium dominated political life. Rome's highest elected officials, the consuls and praetors, were expected to carry out their day-to-day governance from within its boundaries. Legislation, administration, court cases, religious rites, all that exciting stuff happened inside the Pomerium, where these officials were constrained by the laws of Rome just like any other citizen. But once they left the Pomerium, they were technically considered to be on military campaign and wielded absolute power over life and death. The Pomerium, then, was the invisible line that separated the military world from the civic world. This dual role was physically represented by their lictors, the bodyguards who followed consuls and praetors around. Inside the Pomerium, lictors carried a ceremonial bundle of sticks. Once they left, they added an axe, advertising to the world. The officials expanded powers. You would think this system would lead to an abuse of power, but it really didn't. Most of the Senate, government buildings, and wealthy citizens lived and worked within the Pomerium. Plus, any decision an official made outside the Pomerium was subject to a court challenge once they were out of office. In this context, the power available outside the Pomerium was useful during a crisis, but didn't factor into normal domestic politics for governors and generals. Known as proconsuls or praetors, the effect of the Pomerium was even more pronounced. When they crossed back into the city, all of their legal command authority evaporated, instantly transforming them back into private citizens. This became a real problem when the Senate needed an active general to attend a meeting. To get around this, the Senate would sometimes agree to trek outside the Pomerium to hold an ad hoc meeting in a public building like a temple. This resulted in a remarkable amount of ping-ponging around to different temples at theaters outside the Pomerium, which I'm sure was annoying to a bunch of grumpy old senators. Another related issue was that in order to stand for office, a person had to enter the Pomerium and declare their candidacy in person. If a candidate was an active general, or even worse, a general posted on the other side of the continent, their only option was to leave their post early and cross the Pomerium, relinquishing their command. This tension between standing for election and retaining one's military command should be a familiar story. Just before the Roman civil war between Caesar and Pompey, one of the central questions was, what will happen to Caesar when he crosses the Pomerium? When it became clear that giving up his command would likely result in banishment or death, he didn't, and that decision led to a civil war. However, and here comes the most important sentence I've ever written, civil wars were the exception, not the rule. This same rule stripping generals of their command when they crossed the Pomerium also applied to regular soldiers. Strictly speaking, there were not supposed to be soldiers on the Italian peninsula at all, but sometimes it was unavoidable. In such cases, it was useful for everyone to know that entering the Pomerium for any reason would mean the end of their military career. Taken as a whole, this law basically made it impossible for any army to enter the Pomerium. No individual crossing the Pomerium could claim to be acting on behalf of the Roman state. As we know, violating the Pomerium was considered a symbolic attack on the city itself, whether it came from a foreign invader or a Roman soldier. Along these same lines, it may not surprise you to learn that weapons were forbidden inside the Pomerium. This was taken quite seriously for swords, but it wasn't unusual for people to show up with clubs and daggers during riots, probably because those things are easier to hide. There were exceptions to this rule, though. During a national emergency, the Senate could appoint a dictator for a 6-month term. Unlike every other Roman official, a dictator's decisions could not be vetoed. More importantly for our purposes, a dictator's command authority did not evaporate when they crossed the invisible line, giving them unchecked power to order soldiers into the Pomerium. As a symbol of this power, a dictator's lictors were allowed to keep their axes and behave as if they were on military campaign at all times. Citizens knew what this meant, and it was a shocking sight to see. The dictatorship was a dangerous tool, so it was used sparingly throughout Rome's history. A similar, more commonly used mechanism was the senatus consultum ultimum, or the final act. With the final act, the Senate empowered the consuls to defend the republic by any means necessary. Any means meant that they could ignore laws, including the laws of the Pomerium. This may seem like a subtle difference, but it's important in the legal system. Under the dictatorship, Rome put the law in the hands of one individual with no oversight. Under the final act, the consuls could ignore certain laws, but the Senate provided oversight. While the results may have looked similar, the final act was much less disruptive to the Roman legal system. The most famous use of the final act came in 63 BCE, when the Senate empowered the consuls to put down a conspirator.